The Philippines is often described as a conservative nation, Catholic, modest. These words are often found in textbooks, sermons, and official speeches. They shape how the country likes to see itself: disciplined, moral, restrained. And yet, for a significant period in Philippine cinema, some of the most widely produced and consumed films were Bomba films, erotic films, films that everyone claimed to condemn but many quietly watched. This contradiction isn't accidental, it's cultural. Bomba films didn't emerge because Filipinos suddenly became obsessed with sex. They appeared because sex was one of the few things left that could still be shown, when so many other things could not be said. To understand why Bomba films existed and why they thrived, we need to stop asking whether they were moral and start asking what they were responding to. Because in a society where speech is controlled, desire does not cease to exist. It finds another language, and for a time, that language was cinema. When people hear the term bomba film, it's often reduced to a single image: nudity, scandal, exploitation. But that simplification misses something important. Bomba films were not underground pornography. They were not hidden on the fringes of society. These films were screened in commercial theaters, advertised openly, and produced within the mainstream film industry. They had plots, they had characters, they had ticket lines. The word bomba itself is telling. It comes from the idea of an explosion, something sudden, disruptive, impossible to ignore. These films were not subtle, but they weren't trying to be. They announced themselves in a media landscape that had become increasingly muted. In the 1970s, Philippine cinema was operating under strict government regulations. Political narratives were closely monitored. Social criticisms was dangerous. Films that challenge authority risked censorship or worse. But stories about the body, about desire, intimacy, and sensation were strangely allowed to exist. This was not freedom, it was a redirection. Bomba films became a genre not because filmmakers were suddenly liberated, but because they were constrained. When filmmakers could no longer speak openly about power, corruption, or fear, the body became the last site where something could still be shown. And audiences responded, not because they were immoral, but because they were human. In 1972, the Philippines entered a period where words became dangerous. With the declaration of martial law, the media was placed under strict control. Newspapers were shut down. Broadcasts were monitored. Films that hinted at political dissent were censored, cut, or banned outright. Stories that questioned power simply ceased to be told, but the body remained. This wasn't an oversight, it was a strategy. Authoritarian regimes often fear ideas more than images. A protest can inspire resistance, a story can organize thought, but desire, when isolated from politics, feels safe. It distracts rather than mobilizes. It absorbs attention instead of directing it outward. Erotic cinema was tolerated because it redirected energy away from resistance and into spectacle. Bomba films, in this sense, were not subversive, they were permitted. They occupied screens while political narratives were erased. They filled theaters at a time when many other stories could not. And yet, this permission came with conditions. The films could show bodies, but not systems. They could depict intimacy, but not injustice. They could provoke sensation, yes, but not reflection. The result was a strange cinematic landscape where desire was visible, but meaning was carefully limited. What audiences experienced wasn't liberation, but a managed release. A pressure valve opened just enough to prevent an explosion elsewhere. And still, even within these constraints, something managed to leak through, because the act of watching itself became a form of telling. People gathered in dark theaters, anonymous and quiet. In a country where public behavior was tightly controlled, these spaces allowed private curiosity to exist without confession. The body on screen became a stand-in for everything else that could not be put into words. Fear, frustration, restlessness. Bomba films did not challenge the regime, but they revealed the cost of silence. If censorship shaped what could be shown, religion shaped how it was judged. The Philippines is not just a Catholic in belief, but in structure. Religion informs family life, education, morality, and social behavior. It teaches what is acceptable to desire and, more importantly, what should never be admitted out loud. In this context, Bomba films didn't exist in opposition to morality, they lived beneath it. Publicly, these films were condemned. Newspapers criticized them, religious leaders warned against them. To admit watching one was to admit moral failure, though privately, they thrived. This created a familiar Filipino pattern: denial without absence. Everyone knew these films existed, everyone knew they were popular, and yet no one claimed responsibility for their success. The contradiction wasn't accidental, it was functional. Catholic morality doesn't erase desire, it teaches shame. Desire becomes something to be hidden, negotiated in private, consumed without acknowledgement. Bomba films fit perfectly into this structure. They allowed desire to exist without conversation. You watched, you left, you never spoke about it again. In a society where sex education was limited and discussion was discouraged, cinema became an informal classroom. But instead of clarity, it offered fantasy. Instead of dialogue, it offered silence. This is why Bomba films felt both transgressive and strangely ordinary. They violated moral codes, but they also complied with them by remaining unspoken. No protests, no debates, just quiet consumption. What appears to be hypocrisy is actually consistency. A culture trained to suppress desire doesn't eliminate it. Instead, it intensifies it. It reroutes it into spaces where it can exist without threatening the moral surface. And for a time, Bomba films became exactly that space. Any discussion of Bomba films ultimately leads to an uncomfortable truth. Many of these films exploited women. That cannot be softened or avoided. The industry was dominated by male producers, male directors, and male audiences. The camera often treated the female body as a spectacle rather than a subject of interest. Consent existed, but it was frequently shaped by economic pressure and limited alternatives. To ignore this is to romanticize the genre, but to stop here is to oversimplify it. For some actresses, Bomba films were not expressions of liberation, but of survival. The Philippine film industry offered few entry points for women without connections, wealth, or family backing. Bomba cinema, however exploitative, paid its actors. It opened doors that were otherwise closed. This does not erase harm, it explains context. Agency and exploitation are not opposites. They often coexist in the same decision. Choosing to participate in Bomba films did not mean freedom from consequence, nor did it mean complete victimhood. The female body became a site where multiple forces collided: desire, poverty, opportunity, and control. These films were not just watched, they were built on unequal structures that extended far beyond the screen. What's revealing is how criticism was distributed. Actresses were shamed, audiences were silent, the system itself was rarely interrogated. Moral outrage focused on bodies, not power, on exposure, not the conditions that made exposure profitable. And in that imbalance, the real story of Bomba films begins to emerge, not as a moral failure, but as a reflection of who bore the cost of public denial. Now, if Bomba films were so widely condemned, the question remains, why did people keep watching them? The most straightforward answer is desire, lust. But that answer is incomplete. Audiences were not drawn to Bomba films simply because they were erotic. They were drawn to the experience of watching them. Audiences were not drawn to Bomba films simply because they were erotic. They were drawn to the experience of watching them. The cinema offered something rare during that period: privacy in public. Inside a dark theater, no one had to explain themselves. There were no confessions, no justifications, no moral performance. You bought a ticket, you sat down, you watched, and when the lights came back on, you returned to the world unchanged, at least on the surface. This mattered. In a society shaped by shame and surveillance, Bomba films created a temporary suspension of judgment. They allowed curiosity without consequence, desire without dialogue, a moment where the body could exist without having to be explained. And this wasn't limited to men. While the gaze was overwhelmingly male, the audience was not singular in its makeup. Couples watched, groups watched, people watched out of curiosity, boredom, loneliness, and sometimes simply because there was little else left to watch. Cinema became a shared secret, not rebellious, not revolutionary, just quietly human. Bomba films did not challenge the system, but they revealed how tightly wounded it was. When a society restricts expression for too long, people don't always push back loudly. Sometimes they retreat into spectacle. And spectacle, especially when it involves the body, becomes easier to consume than truth. What audiences were responding to wasn't just nudity. It was access to something unspoken, to something forbidden, to something that felt briefly honest in a culture trained to pretend. By the early 1980s, Bomba films began to disappear from mainstream cinema, not because desire faded, but because the conditions changed. Censorship laws shifted, martial law ended, home video entered Filipino households. What once required a public theater could now be accessed privately. The spectacle no longer needed a big screen. Bomba films didn't die, they lost their monopoly. Erotic imagery scattered across new platforms. Late-night television, imported VHS tapes, tabloids, and eventually, the internet. Desire became fragmented, personalized, and algorithmic. And yet the pattern remained. The Philippines continued to perform conservatively publicly while negotiating desire quietly. Sexy noontime show segments framed as entertainment. Viral scandals are condemned and endlessly replayed. Online content consumed privately, then morally disavowed in comment sections. The language changed, the screens changed, the contradiction did not. What Bomba cinema once concentrated into a single genre is now diffused across various media, less visible as a category, but more pervasive than ever. The fascination never left, it simply learned how to hide better. Looking back, Bomba film tells us very little about morality and a great deal about pressure. They reveal a society negotiating desire without vocabulary, a culture that restricts discussion but rewards spectacle, a moral framework that emphasizes restraint while quietly depending on release. Bomba films were not an embarrassment in Philippine cinema. They were a symptom of censorship that silenced dissent, of religion that moralized without educating, of inequality that forced bodies to become currency. They show us what happens when desire has nowhere else to go. And perhaps that's why these films are still discussed today. Not out of nostalgia, but recognition. Because the tension they expose hasn't disappeared. It has only become more sophisticated. Bomba films were never just about sex. They were about silence, about control, about the things a society allows itself to feel but refuses to name. They existed because the Philippines needed them to exist. Because when expression is restricted, it doesn't vanish. It reroutes into bodies, into spectacle, into entertainment that carries more weight than it admits. To dismiss Bomba films as mere immorality is to miss their significance. They were a mirror held up to a culture caught between faith and flesh, discipline and desire, performance and truth. And that mirror still exists. The platforms have changed, the aesthetics have changed, but the question remains the same. What happens to desire in a society that refuses to talk about it honestly? Perhaps the answer has always been cinema.